do this Leetcode customer who visited but did not make any transactions. So we have a schema and we want to write our SQL query to the right. So we have two tables. First is table visits. We're going to have column and type, of course, when we look at the schema. So first we have visit ID and customer ID. Both are type int. The visit ID is the column with unique values for our table. This table contains information about the customers who visited our mall. The next table, which is table transactions, is going to have three columns. Transaction ID is a column with unique values for our table. This table contains information about the transactions made during the visit ID, so not a great description for either of these, but totally fine because when it asks us to solve this, we can do it with confidence. So we want to write a solution to find the IDs of the users. Let's stop right there. We want to write a solution to find the IDs of the users. Let's use a select statement, and we want to get the user IDs. So that's going to be customer IDs. Let's do select customer, and then we'll do underscore ID. Now, since we're having two tables, I want to make this a custom name. So what I'm going to do in a from right here is I'm going to say that our customer visits table, so I'll do visits, is going to be called v1. So when we look at customer ID, we should have v1.customer ID. That's how we're going to look at this. So that kind of solves this next part. It's going to be from the visits table, and we're going to have to somehow relate these two together. And I already see how we can do that with our visit ID. After we write a solution to find the IDs of the users who visited without making any transactions, that's the next thing we have to do. So without making any transactions. So this should happen where our transaction is, there's nothing, right? So when our transaction ID is null. When our transaction ID is null, then nothing's gonna happen. But before we do this, we need to join these two together. So let's do this with a left join. We're going to pass in our transactions. So all of this information will get stored into here. If it's a little bit hard to understand what's happening, let's look at an example real quick. So we have this as our input for visits and this as our input for transactions. The visits ID is going to go with the visits ID inside of here basically, and since it's a left join, anything that, like let's say 1, there's a visit ID here, right? There's a 1 here, so 12 and then 910 will be related to it. However, with this 4, for example, there's no visit ID in here with 4, so that's going to be a null, and that's important because that's where we can check this transaction ID. So let's join these together. I'm going to make it a left join, and we're going to want to join the table transactions. And then let's rename this one as well. We'll call it T1. So we're going to have to change this to T1 for the transaction ID. So left join transactions T1, and then we want to join this on the fact that our T1 dot, and then what are we joining it on? Well, we're joining it on our visit ID. So I'll copy this and paste it in here, and this has to be equal to our V1 dot visit ID. And that is going to be our left join. So any transaction and the number of times they made these types of visits. So we have to count how many times the customer has been here. And there's two things that we need to do for this. So let's make a comma here because obviously we need to print something else out. And in our output, we need to rename this as a count number trans. So whatever we do in here, it needs to be as count number trans. So we're just gonna have to put something in front of this. Well, you can see that if we were to go through this, we want to print our customer ID, and we'll say visit ID, well, it exists in here, so we're not gonna print that. 2 exists, we skip that. Now, 4 doesn't exist in here, so we're going to print this 30. If we look down here, there you can go. We can see 30 being printed. It's printed 1 time. If we look at this 54 for customer ID, we can see that these ones right here, these two 54s, are null. So they're going to increment, and that's why there's 2 right here. The way we can do this incrementation is with a count function. And this count function is going to count up what? Well, it has to count up how many times the specific customer visits. This is going to be based on our customer ID. So we're going to count every single time. We're basically going to increment at every single time that we see this customer ID. Now, how does it keep track of which ID we're doing? Well, to do something like that, we need a group by. So we're going to group by our v1.customer ID. And that's pretty much it. We can go ahead and submit this and see what we get. Here's the code, by the way. Let me scroll it down a little bit so you can see all of it. And that's going to solve our problem. Let's go back to the description and do a quick summary over it again. So essentially what we're doing, here's the description right here, is we want to select from our customer table, and we want to select the customer ID. We also want to select a incrementing kind of counter, calling it count number trans, and its counter is based on how many times the customer ID visits the store. It's going to happen from our visits table, and we want to left join our transactions T1 on our visit ID for T1 and V1. V1 being our visits table and T1 being the transactions table. And this is going to happen where our T1.transaction ID is null, because when we join them together, like down here, and it's null, that means they didn't transact anything. They didn't buy anything. And that's what we want to print here. And then we want to group by the V1 customer ID. Grouping by the customer ID will help us with this count. So if you have any questions about the SQL, please leave a comment below. And if you want more Leetcode SQL, check out that playlist below the like button.